Hi, welcome to Lesson 2 on Native Americans. We'll be needing to know our vocabulary for today. You will hear about cultural identity, which is a group's common practices, beliefs, and traditions, and the ways in which its members are connected to those practices, beliefs, and traditions. You'll need to hear about development, an important change or growth. Dispersed is a verb, spread across or broken up. Embellished, to decorate or add to something to make it more beautiful or interesting. Environment, a person's physical surroundings and surrounding conditions. Generation, all of the people of about the same age within a society or a family. Lush is characterized by full and healthy growth, covered with a thick growth of healthy plants. So, what did we learn yesterday? Well, we learned about the theory that most of the early inhabitants of North America came from Asia across an area known as Beringia, or came in little boats bumping around the coastline to end up in North America. And how does this area look today? Well, the area between Asia and North America is covered with water, the Bering Strait. When it was dry, because of a lot of the water being locked up in ice and the water levels dropping, we called it Beringia. So, how did these early Americans acquire their food? Well, they were nomads. They followed their large prey animals in order to be able to continue to eat. What are regions? Well, they're different areas of land, and we'll hear that these different regions where different Native American groups settled were really instrumental in how these people changed their way of life. How did they live? Well, it depended on where they lived. So let's learn about it. As you learned in the previous read aloud, when they continued to hunt, fish, and gather, many native people also began to farm. This was a very important development that changed native people's way of life quite significantly and importantly. They began to plant and harvest crops such as squash, beans, and maize. Maize is corn. Farming added to the food supply and allowed some groups of people to have the choice to stay in one place instead of migrating to follow their prey. Native people's knowledge and understanding of nature, particularly of these plants, was acquired over many years. And over time, they experimented with growing local grasses and gourds. Eventually, many of them developed the ability to grow a wider variety of plants. In addition to increasing their food supply by farming, Native people also began to use plants to make such things as clothing, medicine, homes, and household items. They began to raise animals such as turkeys while continuing to hunt, gather, and fish. Excuse me, allergy season. And so, after a long period of time, many native people, having migrated across North America, came to live in groups called tribes. Each tribe had its own name, language, set of beliefs, and overall cultural identity. How each tribe lived, their clothes the tribe members wore, the food they ate, and the homes they lived in depended greatly upon the environment in which they lived. This is especially true of language. Different words were created that related specifically to regional beliefs and habitats. And so, the languages of these native people became widely different from region to region and from tribe to tribe within a region. Trade brought native people from different regions together, and a greater understanding of farming techniques spread. When tribes from different regions met to trade, they not only shared their ideas of farming techniques, they also traded crops and seeds. In this way, tribes began growing crops that were not native to the region in which they lived. With more reliable food supplies and the ability to store corn for 2 to 3 years to be used when there was not a good harvest, the population of Native people in North America began to increase, and large settlements began to develop in different regions. That's not to say that all tribes settled in one place, however. Some, such as the Shoshone, Cheyenne, and Blackfoot of the Central Plains, never really settled in a true sense of the word. They chose a nomadic existence, following the enormous herds of buffalo that moved with the seasons. The buffalo provided them with everything they needed, including food, clothes, and the teepees they lived in. It's believed that at one time, more than 30 million buffalo roamed parts of North America. The culture of these Central Plains tribes grew out of their nomadic lifestyles. Other groups, such as the Southeastern Cherokee and Northeastern Iroquois, moved from place to place in the wintertime when the earth would not yield any food, and hunting was the only way to survive. Tribes such as these returned to their settlements in the spring. Nevertheless, once large native populations began to live in settlements, there came the need for new rules. These rules were designed to help a large number of people live together in one place, and so native tribes created their own unique governing systems. Generally, elected leaders or strong family groups were responsible for establishing tribal law and making sure that they were obeyed. Spiritual leaders also guided their communities and participated in the decision-making process. Eventually, individual tribal laws, languages, clothing, customs, and religious beliefs began to set them apart from each other. For all tribal groups, their day-to-day activities and the construction of their homes were largely determined by the region in which they lived and the local resources available to them. That's a really important statement. Let me read it again. For all tribal groups, their day-to-day activities and the construction of their homes were largely determined by the region in which they lived and the local resources available to them. Consequently, their cultural identity became linked to a specific region. For example, some of the tribes living on the Great Plains, an enormous area of grassland, did not have an abundance of trees to use for building. Instead, some homes were made out of soil, grass, and roots, whereas others were made out of animal hides and were called teepees. In the Southwest, native people called Pueblo used clay bricks and stone to construct tall Pueblo buildings. They learned how to farm with a limited or very small amount of water. The Iroquois tribe of the Northeast, where trees were abundant, built long houses out of wood and bark that provided warm shelters during the cold and snowy winter months. They hunted the animals of the forest, such as deer and rabbits, and wore animal furs in the wintertime. Southeastern tribes lived close to the coast, on the lush hills, and in the mountains. The Southeast fishermen, as well as Native Americans in other regions, built boats, set nets and traps in the rivers, and hunted fish with spears. Farmers grew corn, beans, and squash. They also raised sunflowers and tobacco. Their homes were made from mud and clay, with roofs of brush and sometimes river cane. On the northwest coast, native tribes would build plank houses using long, flat planks or boards of cedar wood, which grew in great abundance in that region. They relied on the bountiful or large supply of fish, mostly salmon, as well as seals and porpoises. They even hunted whales. In the Arctic and subarctic regions, the Inuit also hunted whales and continued to perfect ingenious ways of surviving in this oft frozen land, including building igloos, which you'll hear more about later. Although cultural identity was determined in large part by the region in which a group was located, that does not mean that all groups within a region shared the exact same culture. Within each region, There were some cultural differences from one tribe to another, just as there are differences among people within a state or region today. Clothes were made from local resources too, and varied enormously from region to region. Furs and animal hides were worn in the colder regions and on the Great Plains. Cloth, woven from plant fiber, was common in warmer regions, and local plant dyes were used to embellish clothes and possessions. Many Native Americans also embellished their skin with markings, piercings, and tattoos. As the people of each tribe developed their own language, they told stories about their own history. They handed down their stories from one generation to the next in this way. They created their own unique fables and mythological tales to help explain the world in which they lived. They celebrated life. They worshipped a variety of natural gods and gave thanks for the resources planet Earth provided for them. By the time Christopher Columbus and other Europeans arrived in North America thousands of years later, the journey that probably began with a nomadic people following herds of prehistoric mammals had brought about the creation of a very different world than that of the Europeans. It was a world that included many hundreds of unique native tribes, farming, trade, diverse cultures, and the building of immense ceremonial mounds. Native tribes were now dispersed or spread all across North America. Because Christopher Columbus thought that he had arrived in a part of Asia called the Indies, he called these native people Indians. However, they never referred to themselves as Indians. Once the Europeans arrived in North America, the traditions of many of these native tribes were threatened and eventually destroyed. Armed confrontation, the introduction of new diseases, and cultural clashes meant that for many of the tribes, much of their traditional way of life was lost to them forever. What had taken thousands upon thousands of years to create was all but gone for the tribes within about 400 years. In the next part of this domain, you'll learn about some of the tribes who survived and still live in various parts of North America. You will discover what made them unique and knowledgeable and how they have helped and continue to help to shape the history and culture of the United States. So, in what ways did the Native Americans change from being nomadic people? Well, some of them, in fact, remained nomadic. But some of these people settled down and continued to farm. Okay, they would continue to hunt and fish and gather, but they would begin to farm for their food. How did trade help the Native Americans gain a better understanding of farming techniques? Well, trading brought together people from different regions. While they met to trade things like crops and seeds, they also exchanged ideas. An important development that took place in the history of the Native Americans was that they began to disperse throughout the continents of North and South America, and they developed different cultural identities. What are some of the things that make up a tribe's cultural identity? Their language, their set of beliefs, their homes, clothing, food, ideas, religions. What are the main reasons the different tribes developed different houses, different food supplies, different clothes, and different languages? It was their environment. How did some of the native tribes use some of the local plant dyes? They used them to embellish their clothing. You know, the Central Plains is an area of grassland with very few trees. So, what types of houses did those early Americans build? They would use what they had: soil, grass, roots, teepees made of animal hides. And in the dry southwestern part of the continent, what type of houses did the Pueblo build? Well, they would build tall buildings out of clay bricks because that's the material they had. What type of homes did the Iroquois build in the snowy northeastern part of the land? Long houses built of wood and bark. That's what they had a lot of. That's what they could build with. And what was the environment like in the southeastern region? Well, there were lush hills and fertile soils, as well as a lot of water, salt water, and also freshwater lakes and rivers. What's the main method of obtaining food for both the Northwest coastal tribes and those of the Arctic and subarctic? Most of those tribes lived near the water and survived through fishing. They fished for fish, they hunted for seals and whales and porpoises, other creatures in the sea or in the water. All right, thank you.